It seems in recent years we've been constantly bombarded by the threat of higher priced video games. The conversations are often about, inflationary adjustments or value propositions for more expansive projects or just a general reflection on human greed. In this video, I wanted to touch on a few of those topics, but I mainly hope to leave you, the viewer, with a better understanding of the processes and variables involved when publishers start to test prices. I think a bit of a recap of our latest mainstream price increase from Nintendo will provide some interesting context as well as something for me to refer back to later. Recently, Nintendo started testing $70 the base price for their first-party games, along with the launch of the very hyped Nintendo Switch 2. This isn't exclusive to them. Many publishers have been toying with the idea, but Nintendo took it, an extra step further when it comes to setting the precedent. Why is that $60 price tag so significant? Because $60 has been the staple new AAA game price for as long as most gamers can realistically remember. And that's because it became a full, consumer expected standard over 20 years ago with the launch of the 360 and the PS3. Not many people remember that, $10 price increase is clearly 20 years down the road. Let's keep that little nugget in mind throughout this video. Nintendo have largely gotten away with it, as it were, considering their Switch 2 launch sales have set industry adoption records. There was an initial backlash, of course, but we're half a year along and the acceptance has slowly set in. But why is that? And perhaps more importantly to you, would the exact same thing happen with the $100 games? The most important variable, but not the only one, that answers that question is the hype level of the product.
Welcome to the Game Awards 2025.
Once you understand the very basic principle that consumers will generally accept price increases proportional to the hype of the product, you'll begin to understand when publishers will think that they can apply higher prices. And you'll also see another angle as to why marketing is just so important. A game that is, say, $40 worth of quality might be accepted by gamers at a $60 price point with the right marketing campaign and presentation. Hype is also the reason why the entire $100 MSRP discussion for video games centers around Grand Theft Auto. Sure, Ubisoft would love to charge $100 for Assassin's Creed and Activision the same with Call of Duty. But sort of anyone familiar with the modern industry knows why those games, while being revenue monsters, don't have the hype or pull with the audience to be the first out the gate to hit that $100 price point, at least confidently. Which is a funny statement to make, I'll admit. If you remember how I mentioned before that 20 years ago during the PS3 and 360 era, prices increased by $10. Well, back then, games like Call of Duty were in fact the titles to rally consumer acceptance behind as far as publishers are concerned. However, frequent release schedules, while very profitable, make the audience a little too familiar with the gameplay loop to be hyped enough to really ignore price. I don't want to derail this video entirely by providing full context as to why Grand Theft Auto as a franchise kept its hype alive, despite being older than the other franchises I've used as examples. But the basics of how the industry views the franchise is of course relevant to why the industry believes Rockstar can get away with effectively a $40 price increase. So let us indulge a little in digression. First, the most basic aspect that separates GTA release schedules. Grand Theft Auto is on release number 6, 28 years after the first release. That is just 5 years between each release as an average. However, in reality, it's been over a decade since the last new GTA experience was given to gamers. The memes surrounding how long we've been waiting exist for a reason. If I use Call of Duty as a benchmark, which makes sense since the franchise did set the previous benchmark for price hikes, there are like 20 COD releases in the same amount of years. Remember economics class? Scarcity of supply and price do tend to correlate. Now, this isn't scarcity of product in the traditional sense, mind you. I'm not suggesting there won't be enough copies of the game, especially with digital availability, but simply that there is no real GTA alternative in the market. And if there is, it isn't competition the way it exists for other subgenres. It has been a decade since a new single-player GTA experience has been made available. That is a low supply of new experiences when it comes to open world, expansive narrative, car stealing, hooker killing, third-person shooter, sandbox adventure games. The same way RTS fans froth at the mouth and critique the hell out of any new game drop is because no one makes them. There's a low supply of that specific game experience. People show up because it's unique. Now, of course, this doesn't mean you can make a shit game, but release it, once a decade and now you're gonna receive big hype. Just like you shouldn't watch a good YouTube video without liking and subscribing. Sorry, but really, Grand Theft Auto is a strong franchise with high expectations earned through consistently high quality releases. People were more hyped by the long wait because they think about 10 years of Rockstar cooking in the kitchen and, don't even question if it's going to be good or not. Really, Rockstar would have to deliver well below public expectations to be anything but a clean sweep at the relevant year's Game Awards. Let's be super honest with ourselves. This whole thought process can be applied to the Nintendo price increases I referenced earlier. Nintendo increased the base MSRP by $10 for multiple titles at once. I said they got away with it, and said the reason was hype. That hype for Nintendo games is a similar mixture of scarcity of releases, consistency in quality, and the expectations created because of it. Nintendo has a good track record with their first-party titles. Sure, there's some hiccups with a few releases, but for the most part, it isn't controversial to say Nintendo is known for being a cut above average when they release a game. Maybe you don't like the genre, or maybe Nintendo games are a little too safe for you, but it's hard to argue that they are bad versions of what they are. And a lot of people enjoy them and associate them with quality releases. Mix it all together and you have the recipe for people accepting, price increase for minimal to no hits to your volume sold. We have at least 2 case studies laid out before us where a price increase may be accepted by the consumer due to the context surrounding them. But by no means is every AAA release worth a big price tag. Different publishers and franchises aren't GTA. No one disputes that. So why do other publishers care if the conditions aren't the same for the games to be first? Wouldn't they just focus on doing what Nintendo and Rockstar do? Well, why do that when we can just make the slope very, very slippy?
You got a long, hot summer, you got nothing to do. I tell you, slip and slide is a way to get through. You get wet on slip and slide. You get cool, it's a long, wet ride. And you're hot on a slip and slide. Slip and slide.
The fallacy of a slippery slope is the assumption that A inevitably results in B. Slippery slopes are observed all the time, but what makes it a fallacy is to assume without ample evidence. I would argue no assumption is being made here. We know that publishers are waiting for a successful, high-priced game to set the precedent for charging more for all games. We have a direct quote example from the horse's mouth. They might quickly start pushing $80 if a GTA does well at $100. At least $20 more isn't $40 more. A few years of that rhetoric, and you stop associating $60 with a game's price altogether. In fact, it might take a video release 2 decades later to remind you that you used to pay a lower dollar value for your games. I know there's a huge subsection of the potential audience screaming at me the whole time that my arguments are missing a huge variable when it comes to publishers taking gamers' money in the year of 2025. Microtransactions. Ooh, it feels dirty enough to bleep. There we go. Micro or not so microtransactions in games is the hidden cost of game prices for video games in the modern era. It has become a rarity that you can buy a game with no further shop interaction needed to experience that game. A $60 totally adhering to the current pricing standards game might include a $30 to $40 DLC to really have the full experience. Years of this, and gamers have caught on to the fact that the initial cost to play won't be the last time they will be expected to get their wallet out. This makes any further price increase all the more sensitive to the consumer. Publishers put a good amount of effort to make the extra content feel super cool and not really optional, and often succeed in that task. They have teams concocting marketing spells at Blizzard as we speak. But the result is, as I said, gamers feel like that optional DLC is not so optional anymore. If you break it down, the full experience for most games costs $100 already. I find myself pondering about the situation if GTA had been, announced for $60 along with a $40 optional but not really optional day one DLC. Would people be as fearful? I think slightly less. And it's not because I'm cynical about people's ability to do math. It's more obviously based on the current status quo. Gamers in tune with how the industry is shifting expect to pay $100 for the base game and still have to pay that $30, $40, $50 of DLC on top. And they probably aren't wrong either, let's be honest. Now also throw in the tendency for things like shoddy release builds from AAA publishers becoming a frequent occurrence, and consumer skepticism to that level doesn't seem so absurd. It is again a slippery slope argument. You just know some shitty greedy publisher will put out reskin sequel slop for whatever industry price you can get away with, along with every microtransaction trick in the book layered throughout. And consumers will either respond or not, of course. If consumers respond too negatively, then there's always next time in 3 to 5 years to push the limit, but it definitely stifles their plans. It does always come down to, did pricing higher make us more money in the end? But again, being very real, if a higher pricing precedent is set, then everyone will jump at it, not just the most greedy. People will want to match their competition at the least. It is very important for me to reiterate again though, that $100 serves as a precedent to make the range between, say, $60 and $90 feel much more acceptable by comparison. Now, of course, let's be realistic and less cynical. Some amount of publishers will take the time to put out a quality product, and in some cases even need to actually, no lie, charge a certain price simply to be profitable. The stars do align sometimes. Most publishers, however, will probably jump on the coattails of successful franchises to say, look, it should be fine if we price like that as well. And the only thing that will stop them is the natural balance of capitalism. When the price becomes so high that your sales volume plummets. If games are too expensive, people will prioritize them less. Publishers have been applying their desired price hikes so far with the quote-unquote optional DLC. The base price has been holy for so long as a result. Everything comes down to consumer reaction, and I personally don't think $70 is the breaking point for consumers just looking at what we can see historically. And $70 feels like the true short-term goalpost of publishers. I think a $100 price would cause a much more drastic and undeniable drop in sales volume for nearly all AAA franchises. $100 scares people off, but $100 makes for an amazing price to compare your much lower $70 price point to. And that's a massive reason why other publishers care so much about a successful AAA $100 game from Rockstar. Thanks very much for watching to the end, and I'm still balancing being concise and covering as many of the branching topics that are available to explore in a full video essay, like this. With that said, if there are any topics I may have mentioned but didn't expand enough on, or even that I failed to mention that you would like me to dive into in a future video, let me know in the comments below. Like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.